yeah, thanks for joining us here today, guys, and thanks for having myself, David, and the rest of the team share this beautiful Saturday morning with you. Um, as David has touched on, I'll be talking about sharks and rays with a particular focus on Queensland and the Great Barrier Reef, and we'll touch into the fishing issues a bit later into it. But first, generally, we'll start with, I suppose, a general overview of sharks and rays in Australia. Just a very quick sort of skim over their biology and some of the threats they face. And then we'll briefly touch on, I suppose, who I am and how I got to work at the AMCS, because I'm sure you want to hear more about sharks and rays than what you do hear about me. And then we'll kind of do a little bit more of a deep dive into the sharks and rays in the Great Barrier Reef, some of the key species and the threats they face. Also, we'll touch on the issue of shark culling, which inevitably everyone asks about because it is such a polarizing issue. And then we'll also look into the good news, what AMCS actually has done for sharks over the years and what our Shark Champions campaign moving forward intends on doing for sharks and rays. So to start with, Australia is a shark and ray hotspot of the world. In our waters, we've got about 322 species, and this equates to about 1/4 of all the world's shark and ray species. So it's quite a lot in, I suppose, our little corner of the world. Of those 322 species, half of them aren't found anywhere else in the world. And this is what we refer to as an endemic species. So whenever you hear the word endemic, it means not pandemic, but endemic. Whenever you hear the word endemic, it means essentially it's only found in a particular spot. So as I said, about 322 species or thereabouts, about half of them are endemic to Australia. So they're found nowhere else. And as you can see here on the slide, you've got about 39% of our shark species and about nearly 70% of our ray species. So in fact, most of our rays you can only find here. And this really brings home the issue that when it comes to their conservation, if we don't save them, if we don't look after them, no one can, because like we've just learned, they're nowhere else. When we have a quick look at their biology, so sharks and rays are known as elasmobranchs, and these are cartilaginous fish. So they don't have mineralized hard bones like we do. It's bones like in your nose and in your ears, that cartilage structure. Typically, sharks and rays are very slow to mature, give birth, and they live a long time. So generally speaking, if you kind of take an average of how all sharks and rays reproduce, you're looking at about 10 years before they become sexually mature. And even once they're mature, they'll give birth to maybe 4 to 6 pups every 2 to 3 years. Now, again, that's very much just an overall average. It exists on a spectrum. So if you look at one end of the spectrum, you've got, say, gummy sharks, which are fished out from Victorian waters. Gummy sharks are your smaller species, and smaller sharks and rays tend to breed a bit quicker. And gummy sharks will kind of mature at about 6 to 8 years old. And they'll give birth to maybe 20 or 30 pups every year or so. On the other end of the spectrum, and typically of your larger sharks, they typically reproduce a lot slower and live a lot longer. You're looking at a dusky shark. So the dusky shark is like a typical looking shark, and it's also found in the Great Barrier Reef. And the dusky shark, females mature at about 18 years old or thereabouts, and they can be pregnant for up to 2 years. And then once they do give birth, they need another year just to recover from that. So when we talk about overfishing and the threats sharks face, you can see how we can fish them faster than they can actually replace themselves. Generally, sharks in an environment are keystone species. Now, what that means is that sharks are typically at the top of a food chain and they keep everything more or less regulated and in balance. I'm sure most of you are aware of what a food pyramid looks like, or a food chain kind of looks like, with your apex predators at the top. And as you kind of work your way down, you got your herbivores, your invertebrates, and then your seagrasses and so forth. But what you might not be aware of is the term keystone, and this is used in science a lot. So this comes from the fact that, as you can see in the picture here, when you look at architecture in an arch, there's a keystone block in the middle. That keystone block, using the forces of physics, actually holds that arch in place. So when you remove that keystone, that whole arch falls apart. Another example of a keystone species I remember learning when I was at uni, when we did some field trips down towards Western Port Bay. I'm originally from Melbourne, by the way. is a sea star. So even on the intertidal zones, you can have keystone species like sea stars, where if you remove them, entire ecosystems, even mini ecosystems around rock pools can be really affected. But when we look at oceans and we look at sharks, they're typically at the top. And in a nutshell, healthy oceans need sharks. It's pure and simple. I just touched on the threat. So this is from the IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And this is their red list. And what this is, it's basically the Earth's catalogue of living species and the threats that they face, or at least who's in danger. When we look at sharks and rays, in terms of marine life, second only to reef corals, 30% of them, of all species, are at risk of extinction. And that's the highest form of any marine life. To put that into even more context, mammals are at 26. So when you consider lions, bears, even kangaroos and some of our threatened animals, mammals as a group aren't as threatened as sharks and rays. But I call it tragically, sharks and rays, in a general sense, are often somewhat ignored because, they live in an ocean, they live in the deep water, we don't know a lot about them, and they're out of sight and out of mind. So there really is this importance in terms of our ocean health to really look after our shark and ray populations. And as I said, the main threat is commercial fishing. But aside from that, you've also got added threats such as water pollution, coastal development as our cities grow larger as well. I've just checked that I haven't missed anything. I'm pretty sure I haven't. Yeah, sorry, I should also touch on, and this is a really cool fact, and that is that sharks and rays have been on the Earth for about 400 to 450 million years. So that's longer than the dinosaurs. They've survived 5 mass extinctions. But in all their history, it's probably only in the past 100 years or so since we've started mass industrialized fishing that they're starting to face the threat of extinction. So I remember trying to do a calculation where if I put 450 million years in terms of a 24-hour clock, if we look at commercial fishing, say in the past 120 years, that equates to, from memory, less than 1/100th of a second. So if in 24 hours, in less than 1/100th of a second, we've managed to nearly bring an entire group of animals to its knees. So it really is important that we do look after our sharks and rays. So a little bit about myself. I remember when I first applied for the job, I said to myself, I said, what the fruit is a bloody shark campaigner? I had no idea. It's the strangest job title I'd ever heard, but at the same time, the coolest. So what my role is at AMCS is similar to David's. I'm a campaigner. So I'm that middle person between the science and the research and the scientists, and also the public and communication awareness and government. My background, I did a PhD at Monash University studying sharks and rays, which I finished up in 2016. So I consider myself quite fortunate in that, for the lack of a better phrase, I can speak the science and understand the science, and then have the ability to translate it and communicate it to the broader public and government and deliver change. So with all the issues that go on in our fisheries and our oceans, again, we communicate with scientists, we understand the picture, we understand what has to happen, where the threats are, how they can be addressed. And then my role is to then communicate this to the public, raise awareness to people such as yourselves, get you guys on board, and also communicate these issues to our governments and our state governments and say, look, this needs to change. We need to make these laws. Fisheries have to operate this way. And I should also mention that we do work a lot with the fishing industry as well. So we talk a lot within fishing groups. And again, it's a matter of how do we move forward into the future and ensure that our fisheries remain healthy, and at the same time, people can still enjoy seafood moving forward. And as is quite obvious, my perspective is very much from the sharks and rays. But generally speaking, if you look after sharks and rays in a fishery in terms of how it operates, in a general sense, you're pretty much looking after everything else as well. So it's kind of a poster child where we can use sharks and rays to deliver really good outcomes for a range of other species as well. In terms of how I got to AMCS, as I touched on, I did my PhD at Monash University. I've always, since I was a kid, had passion for sharks. I drew them, I tried to read every book I could, and I really loved science as well. So by the time I got to uni, I put the two together. I was like, marine biology, too easy, done. Let's give this a crack. And then I was lucky enough to pursue a PhD project where I looked at how commercial fishing affects shark and ray populations. And then once that had finished up, I was looking for work, and I hadn't really found work for about 6 or so months, and I was getting quite, to be honest, quite depressed about it. And I remember sitting at my table and chair one afternoon on a Sunday, and I literally typed in sharks, fishing, jobs, because they were the three things that I needed or knew about. And the job for a senior shark campaigner was the first thing on Google. So it's amazing what you can find through Google sometimes. And yeah, I read the job description, it ticked all the boxes, and I'm very fortunate enough to be here and do what I'm doing. So that's how I got here. So as David was saying, the Great Barrier Reef is facing the threat of climate change, but there's also fishing issues as well. But before we get stuck into that, in terms of sharks raised in the Great Barrier Reef, we're looking at about 134 species that call it home. And as we talked about earlier in terms of the food web, sharks are critical to the reef's health. There are studies that show that the number of sharks also influence the number of fish that are around a reef, the size of fish that are around a reef, and in a nutshell, without sharks, our reefs are poorer for it. And this flows on to tourism. People want to see colourful fish, they want to see a lot of fish, even some people who enjoy recreational fishing like I do. You want to go out and responsibly fish and know that there's going to be fish there. So sharks are really important to that as well. And also having sharks on the reef, a study from a few years back showed that they're worth about $1.9 million to tourism, shark diving. So keeping sharks alive is also economically a good thing as well. And it allows people to connect with the ocean and to experience it in all its wonder. And as I'm sure you're aware, Great Barrier Reef is home to some of the most iconic species that we know of. Everything from tiger sharks to manta rays, including the world's only pink manta ray, who's been nicknamed Inspector Clouseau from the Pink Panther. From memory, the pink manta ray floats around Lady Elliot Island up north in the Great Barrier Reef. But yeah, some of the most iconic species: tiger sharks, black-tip reef sharks, manta rays, whale sharks, even. And even some white sharks often sort of flow through there as well. So it's this vibrant, biodiverse, rich hotspot on the planet that really needs to be looked after. And the way I address it in the Great Barrier Reef is through the lens of commercial fishing. So let's look at the scalloped hammerhead in particular. Now, the scalloped hammerhead as a species occupies sort of the subtropical and tropical regions of the world, and including Australia. So everywhere from about New South Wales right around to the northern sort of parts of Western Australia. Now, the scalloped hammerhead at the moment is critically endangered, and they're getting particularly hammered, pun intended, in the Great Barrier Reef. But before we go into that, let's just have a quick look at their biology and sort of fall in love with them first. So most people ask, why the hammer? It's still a bit of an unknown to science, but what we do know about the hammer is we suspect that it enables the shark to actually be really quick at turning. It can turn really sharp just because of the way it's designed. So it's kind of like it's hydrodynamic in the water. On top of that, it's able to, the way its eyes are positioned, it's able to kind of sense and see prey both above and below. So it really is this fine-tuned piece of equipment that enables a scalloped hammerhead to hunt better and be aware of its prey more acutely. In terms of its reproduction, again, long-lived, they take a while to reproduce. But mums, it's currently thought that mums from Australia will actually, once they've grown up, they'll swim offshore. And as they're pregnant, they'll be in Indonesia, in the Indonesian waters. The danger about this is that Indonesian fisheries generally are a lot more poorly managed than Australian fisheries. So mums are quite vulnerable to being caught there. But for those mums that do survive their pregnancy in Indonesia, the thinking is that they actually sometimes would come home and perhaps to the very same beaches that they were born in to give birth to the pups themselves. And this concept of, they call it natal philopatry, which basically means being born or giving birth to pups in the same place you were born. It's actually reasonably common in quite a few shark species. So the thinking is that big adult mums born in Australia head over to Indonesia. When they're pregnant, they come back and they give birth back in the beaches that they were from. In Queensland waters in particular, the decline is estimated to be anywhere between about 60% and 80%. It's quite broad because, again, we don't know too much about the scalloped hammerhead, and the data that we rely on historically, and even at the moment, is pretty poorly recorded. And that goes to speak to fisheries management, so how we operate our fisheries throughout the years. And obviously, the better data you have, the more informed you can and more sustainable you can make your fishery. The poorer the data, the poorer it's going to be, and the environment's going to suffer for it. But to our knowledge thus far, we do know, and globally at least, the scalloped hammerhead is in really big trouble and they're critically endangered. In the Queensland context, Queensland, this might be a bit of a shock to you, but throughout the entire east coast of Queensland and the entire breadth, or the length, I should say, the Great Barrier Reef, there is a gill net fishery. So a gill net is a fishing net, and it's called a gill net because the idea is that a fish swims into it and it gets trapped around the gills, can't breathe, and therefore dies, and it's an easy catch. The problem with this, aside from just catching sharks and every other fish under the sun, is that it also traps turtles, dolphins, and dugongs. So environmentally, especially in the Great Barrier Reef, this is not an ideal way to fish. With respect to the scalloped hammerhead, they're really, really vulnerable to nets, purely because of the shape of their head. So again, the theory is with nets is that although they don't select for what kinds of animals get caught, they select for the size of animals that get caught. And by that I mean when it comes to fish, because of the diamond shape and the way fish are shaped, smaller fish swim through the net and bigger fish bounce off the net. And that ideal size range that you're looking for, depending on how you shape your net, is what gets caught. But with the hammerhead, because of the shape of their head, adults, kids, the whole size range get caught. And hammerheads are really, really sensitive to capture, and about 8 in 10 of them are going to be dead. And the science shows 8 in 10 are going to be dead by the time they're brought up. And even if they are released alive, the chances of survival are quite slim. And these nets can be up to 1.2 kilometres in length. So to give you an idea of how big that is, it's like lining up about 93 buses, putting 7 MCGs side by side. Or if you've had the luck of having visited the Eiffel Tower in France, imagine 4 of those, lengthwise, kind of stacked on top of each other. That's how big these nets are, and they're operating in the Great Barrier Reef. So wrap your head around that. It's a pretty dire situation. At AMCS, we're campaigning to improve the protection of the scalloped hammerhead, and also one of our objectives is to get these nets out of the reef for good. And our campaign's called Shark Champs, which I'll touch on later on, and I'll show you how you can add your name to that petition and stick with us, so down the road that when we do need to ramp up the pressure, we can. The other thing in Queensland is shark culling. Now, this is a very, very, very polarising issue. Politically, it's very, very it's very sensitive in the sense that politically, no politician is willing at the moment to abandon shark culling because they fear that if they do it and someone gets bitten, then their colleagues within Parliament are going to use that against them. So it's very much a political game. That's the general political sentiment around shark culling. Environmentally, shark nets catch whales as well as a range of multiple other forms of marine life. Drum lines, the same, can catch dolphins as well, and a range of other sharks that are more or less non-aggressive. And in terms of safety, again, it's quite polarizing because you do have people that have misconceptions around drum lines and shark nets, that they do keep them safe, when in fact they don't. There's no scientific evidence to suggest that they do. So the Queensland government, historically over the past 60 years that shark culling has been in operation, are running with this idea that the perception of safety is far more important than actual safety. And by that I mean they would rather have drum lines and nets out there so that it looks like everything's safe, when in fact it's not. And so to delve into the science a bit more, I'll give you a bit of context. So throughout the Queensland coastline, there's 383 drum lines, and these are giant baited hooks that hang in the water. And there's 27 shark nets. There's a map there on the screen's right. And that's just the Cairns region. and you'll notice that there's a slightly darker blue patch. That's in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So even within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, there are drum lines. And just outside it, there are also drum lines as well. That'll also give you an indication that, you know, they're not this long continuous barrier. They're just put in spots. You could argue that they're put randomly in spots too. So that's the kind of physical layout of the shark control equipment. But from the science side of things, we've done some research, and with regards to shark nets, they're not barriers. They're nets that are about 180 odd meters long. They're maybe about 4 to 6 meters in depth, and sharks can swim under them, and other animals too can swim under them, over them. And what they've found is that with one study they did, they found that of all the sharks that were actually caught in the nets, about 40% of them were on the shore side. So that basically means that sharks were doing their thing. They were living in the water, chilling out, doing their thing while people were surfing, swimming and whatever. And then when a shark said, you know what, I'm actually going to go back and swim offshore, it got caught in the net. So came in fine, but then on its way out, it got caught. And so that's about 40% of them on the shore side get caught. So they're not barriers. They're just invisible walls of death, basically. And as you might have seen on the news recently, we had 4 whales entangled in 1 month, and 3 of them were in just as many days. So it's another thing AMCS is working on in collaboration with the Humane Society International as part of our Shark Champions campaign. And that is helping the Queensland government and New South Wales government move away from lethal forms of shark control into non-lethal forms. And by non-lethal forms, it's technologies like drones that can survey the air, that can alert people to any dangers. And they have the added benefit of actually helping lifesavers save people from drowning. And drowning kills on Queensland beaches about 20 people a year. So there's bang for buck there. There's other programs like smart drum lines where sharks get caught, but they then get, a message gets sent out to scientists. They then race out, tag the shark and release it. So we know where sharks move, and we've got stations out in the water so that they ping. So again, we know where they're moving, we know why they're moving, and at the same time, people are safer and marine life is safer, and we're learning more about how the ocean works. And an integral part of all this is community education. Informing people accurately about the ocean, about how it works, about the risks, about sharks, so that when people do go into the ocean, they're aware of things and they can make the decision for themselves. So after massive amounts of rainfalls in Queensland or New South Wales, it's wise not to go swimming near rivers after massive amounts of rainfall, because the science shows through tagging bull sharks that bull sharks will spike in terms of the numbers at river mouths, because the murky water enables them to hunt better, and there's more food available. So if you know that there's these conditions, maybe for the next few days, you know, don't swim there. But again, having a comprehensive education program or campaign, plus drones, and even shark deterrents like they do over in WA that people can wear, these are all ways we can get around it without having to randomly kill marine life for no purpose at all. So as I touched on with the whale entanglements, we recently did an action out on the Gold Coast beaches called Nets Out Now that we spelt out in surfboards. And we're hoping that in the very near future, for at least the whale migration season, the Queensland government will pull the nets out. But I suggest you guys hop on board. If you really want, you can ring the Queensland Fisheries Minister. If you visit AMCS's Facebook page under events, there's a Queensland Nets Out Now action, and that's got all the instructions you need, contact details, a script you can use to call the office. But yeah, stay tuned, because there's going to be some more action on that, and we're hoping for some very good news very shortly. And speaking of good news, you know, there is hope. We've got quite a few Sharky wins so far. In the past, AMCS has been able to secure habitat protection for the grey nurse shark. It's critical habitats on the east coast. There's only about 2,100 grey nurse sharks left, they suspect. Not in a good spot, so these habitat protections are really crucial for them to breed. We made live shark finning illegal. We were integral to that process. In 2018, we reduced the amount of, no, not 2018, a bit earlier than that. We reduced the amount of sharks fished in the Great Barrier Reef by 300 tonnes. So that equates to about 60,000 sharks. To give you an idea at the moment, in Queensland in general, fisheries are allowed to fish 600 tonnes of shark. So quite a lot. But yeah, so we managed to reduce it by 300 tonnes by law. and we intend on pushing that further and reducing it even further. And in 2018, we managed to secure 17,500 square kilometres of WA coastline and protect that from shark finning. And the added benefit to that is where those protections are, there are sea lion colonies. So we're also helping the Australian sea lion recover as well. And this touches on what I mentioned earlier, that sometimes, you know, people might say, oh, but you're only looking after one animal. But actually that one animal is a bit of a poster child, and the effects of protecting that animal or that species or that group of animals actually extends to the broader environment. There's plenty of work for us to do. So if you guys are keen on helping out, you can join us at Shark Champions. So it's sharkchampions.org.au. We've got quite a few petitions on there, as well as an overview of some information about sharks and where they sit in the world and where they sit in Australia. So you can sign petitions there. And as the campaign evolves, you know, we'll have more actions than you can take. Petitions are incredibly important. You might just think that they're just a signature, but politicians do take notice of them, and we get numbers in the thousands. So when we get numbers in the thousands, it gives us a lot of cred when we go to the politicians and say, look, this is how many people care. Things need to change. And the other thing you can do is also download AMCS's Good Fish app. So it's a sustainable seafood guide. And if you like your seafood like I do, this can help you make some informed decisions about what seafood is sustainable to eat. And so that when you eat your seafood, you're also supporting sustainable fisheries and looking after the ocean at the same time. And I always like to tell everyone that we humans, we are the greatest threat to sharks and rays, but it's also very important to remember that we're their only single hope as well. So if we can lift up our game, put up a good fight, we can protect our sharks and rays. So thanks, guys. Fire away with any questions you got.
Thank you,
Thank
Leo.
so much.
Oh my gosh. Oh, there we go. That's better. That's working for me now. Guys, if you've got any questions, type them into the group chat. That was awesome. I reckon you have the coolest job in the world, Leo.
Coolest title.
Definitely coolest title. I would like to get out of the water a lot more.
yeah.
That's the only thing I'm missing. I don't get out of the water enough. So
I was going to say, this is a question I was wondering, but I wonder if everyone else is wondering as well before we go a bit more in depth. What does your day-to-day look like in your role, Leo?
Good question. I like to group it in terms of 3 activities. So one activity is kind of stakeholder and community engagement. And that's very much, you know, talking to fishers, talking to scientists on the phone, talking to researchers, talking to government, talking to members of the public such as yourselves. So there's that aspect there. The other one is very much a communications role. So this is where I help write blogs or media releases whenever shark news comes up or there's an important thing I think people should know about. I also help out with our social media channels. So again, we can, as David said earlier, we can get the really complicated science and distill it into something that's really simple, easy to understand, and attractive to look at so that people really engage with it, whether that's a video or a social media tile. So there's engagement with the community. There's a communications aspect to it. And the third one is probably strategy. And by that, I mean, as being a campaign, you need to have a strategy. You need to know where you're going, why you're going there, who's involved, and constantly have that evolve. So the other part of my job is communicating with other members of my team, like Adrian and Sasha, who communicate next. So, hey guys, I've heard this update, this is happening, or they'll inform me, and then we can adjust how our campaign, more broadly speaking, is going to tackle the issue. So community engagement, communications, and strategizing, and where I can, I get out into the water. So hopefully come August, now that the borders have lifted with here, I'm hoping to do some diving down at Julian Rocks and check out some grey nurse sharks.
Oh,
so I'll go for a dive as well.
Nice. Now, Tiana, there's a couple of questions in the group chat for Leo, isn't there?
Yeah, so Taryn really wants to know what's your favourite shark/ray species. Do you have a favourite?
Yes, I do. I got two. My favourite growing up, and it's equal favourite now, is the great white shark. I know it's pretty basic, pretty typical, but it is. I've had the very good fortune of diving with them in South Africa, and that was just absolutely mind-blowing. Like, they're a lot more gentler than what you think. This particular shark, she was 5 meters long. she bared her teeth once in the whole 45 minutes that we were underwater. So,
Wow.
but yeah, they're actually quite gentle when you're actually under the water with them. My other favourite, and this came from my PhD, is the southern fiddler ray. So this, you guys might have actually seen this in Mornington. It's quite common around the beaches of Vic. And the southern fiddler ray, I actually, as part of my research, looked at how stress affects pregnancy. So when they get caught in trawls, how does that affect their pups and when they're pregnant? And as part of that, I had to go diving, collect them, give them mini ultrasounds. And I kind of looked after the mums until they gave birth in the tanks. And throughout that whole experience, I just appreciated an animal on a whole new level. So they're my equal favourite as well.
Beautiful.
Nice.
You kind of answered Caitlin's question, which is, do you ever go out and see them? But just to extend on that, how often do you get a chance to go out and see them? Is it a regular part of your job, or?
It's not. It's actually not a part of my job as much as I would love it to be. It's actually not technically a part of my job, but that's not to say that I'm not allowed to go out there and go experience things and use that for my work, because that's what I do, especially when I go on diving on the weekends. If I get a chance to do that, I'll take footage and say to the guys at work, hey guys, I've got this really awesome footage, we can use this for whatever reason. But one of the most recent ones was I actually had a chance to help out a researcher on Fraser Island in October last year. And that was, we went shark fishing. We actually had shark fishers do the fishing because it's quite a skilled job. And I went out and gave him a hand. And for me, that was an experience of, like I said earlier about engagement and stakeholders. I had a chance to speak to some shark fishers, speak to other researchers, get involved in the research as well. So it was kind of like networking and understanding, the environment in which I'm working in. And yeah, as part of the experience, we caught a hammerhead, a bronze whaler. We nearly got a tiger shark, but the line snapped about 10 meters from the shore. And when we caught them, we put tags on them and released them. So yeah, it's pretty cool. Bottom line is, if I get a chance to go out there, I'm going. Like, I'm dropping a pen and pencil and I'm going. So.
That's great. We wish we can all get out more, but Victoria's a bit cold. We're all sort of down here.
There is that pandemic thing going on.
Yeah, and that too, that pandemic. Before we let you go, Leo, I have one more question for you. You mentioned, and we see this a lot working at the aquarium and working with the community as well, that with sharks a lot of the time, they don't tend to get, I guess, the protection and the publicity they deserve because you said out of sight, out of mind.
Yep.
What do you think we can do ourselves to try and fix that? Like you guys mentioned, you have education programs going on, but is it just a matter of talking to people about sharks and the facts and the numbers, or everyone's got this perception,
Yeah, so it is a tricky one because it's not like I mean, aquariums to start with, especially ones that are operated really well, like Sea Life aquariums. They're a great place to start because it's a chance for you to actually physically see a shark or a ray and what it looks like and how it interacts with animals around it. Mm-hmm. And even if you get a chance to dive with it, it helps kind of dispel a lot of the myths that you hear about them or a lot of the preconceptions that you might have. So that's a really good starting point. And then the next is, education and understanding the numbers, the facts, the figures, such as, 30% are facing threat of extinction. In Australia, we've got the Scalloped Hammerhead that's critically endangered, yet, which I forgot to mention earlier, in 2018 in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, we caught about 3,000 of these Scalloped Hammerheads in nets from commercial fishing. And of those 3,000, they dumped nearly 2,000 of them. And again, most of these are going to be dead. So it's understanding those stories, those facts, those figures, so you can put your experiences into context. And then, yeah, the other thing is also, don't be afraid to contact a scientist or myself and actually say, hey guys, I've got an idea of what I would like to learn about sharks. Can you help me? That's what I'm here for. Because if I learn what other people want to know about or what other people think that they can do and their ideas, we can then together kind of make that happen. But in terms of something a bit more tangible, again, there's our sustainable seafood guide, Good Fish. And that, again, just helps you make choices that if you do want to eat seafood, you're making responsible and informed choices. And as a result, you can go home knowing that, that the fish that I ate didn't come from a fishery that was hammering hammerhead sharks and dumping them overboard. But in short, I'm happy to send out my email details. I think you have them. to anyone who wants to ask any further questions, has any ideas about what they can do, whether it's in their local school group or whatever, I'm happy to help out. As I said, it's not even my job, it's what I do. And that is to get people on board, get them to care and actually make some positive changes out there.
That would be amazing, Leo. And you mentioned the sharkchampions.org as well. So I'll share that in the notes after this.
I'll write it in the chat box now, actually.
Yeah, perfect. And then I'll put that through and I'll send it through to everyone afterwards. But thank you so much. That was so good to just hear about what's going on and all the good stories as well, not just the sad ones and the ones that were, taking so long to fix. I mean, with the Scalloped Hammerhead, I was at the IUCN Congress in Hawaii 5 years ago now, 4.5 years ago now, and they were trying to help them then. So it's a slow process, but there's so many good things happening in the meantime. So we'll get everyone to jump on board that as well. So
no worries.
Thank you, Leo.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Awesome.